Now we should turn to a more detailed historical analysis of the Western intellectual tradition. I'll take the understanding of Athens and Jerusalem and what they represent as a given. Roman culture was, of course, primarily derived from that of Greek culture. The Romans were a practical people, but their cultural achievements were to a great extent derivative. It's not surprising that the Romans had an epic about the founding of their city and that the Greeks had epic poetry as well. The Romans had tragedy and the Greeks had tragedy. The Romans had comedy and the Greeks had comedy. The Romans had a pantheon with 12 gods in it, and so did the Greeks. In fact, it's remarkable the degree to which there is a continuity in cultural traditions between Greece and Rome, and it's not entirely fair to view Rome as Greece writ large on account of the fact that it is watered down by the size of the empire and by the fact that the Romans' great genius lay in practical matters. They achieved things like breakthroughs in engineering, particularly military engineering and civil engineering. They achieved breakthroughs in architecture. If any of you know the books of Vitruvius, right, beautiful achievements in architecture. And they also managed to extend the idea of citizenship beyond that of the Greek polis, which is perhaps their greatest contribution to the theory of government. And in the process of extending the idea of citizenship and what it means to be a political insider, they also extended the idea of law across the boundaries that had been previously established, and they helped move the idea of law to the center of Western concerns and traditions in government and politics. Now, Roman culture is essentially this worldly, it is essentially practical, and it is essentially aristocratic. It is aristocratic in the sense that it does not recognize any idea like intrinsic human equality. Rather, the Romans had what Nietzsche would call a master and slave, a master morality. They distinguished between the superior and the inferior, and they had no compunctions about oppressing the weak. They, again, had no idea that pity was a great virtue. For them, achievement, even if morally dubious, was the goal of their activity. They pulled a leaf from the book of Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars and tried to achieve glory, perhaps at the expense of moral values, moral strength, moral universality. Now, the chief elements in Roman philosophy were Stoicism, Epicureanism, and skepticism, and it's pretty clear that these are all fragmentary derivations from Socratic philosophy. Epicureanism, oddly enough, can be derived from Socratic philosophy if one is careful how you finesse the text. One can look at Socrates as being an advocate not of self-denial and asceticism, but rather a rational, enlightened hedonist who wants to prevent greater pains or eventual pains that are gotten at the expense of small, transitory, immediate pleasures. It could be that that is the Socratic message, and it is possible, if you read the Socratic dialogues in a particular fashion, to derive a kind of Epicureanism, a kind of refined hedonism out of Socratic philosophy. Now, it's very clear where skepticism would come from in Socratic philosophy, since Socrates is the man who says, "I don't know anything." He constantly goes around questioning, and it's very clear how this would fit into Roman culture. Since Roman culture was a heterogeneous mix of various languages and various peoples and various religious and philosophical traditions, the combination of all these competing ideas has to engender a certain skepticism in the jaded denizens of Rome who see a panorama of competing myths, none of which are consistent and all of which appear dubious. Skepticism is, in some respects, a function of the cosmopolitan nature of Rome and their domination of the Mediterranean basin with its great plurality and diversity of cultures. And it's very clear how a fragment of Socratic philosophy can be resurrected as Roman skepticism. Now, Roman Stoicism, and here I'm thinking particularly of Marcus Aurelius, the great philosopher and emperor, but also Epictetus. Roman Stoicism is also very clearly derivable from Socratic philosophy, because Stoicism is, in fact, a philosophy which says that the senses must be disciplined, the inclinations and appetites must be disciplined, not rejected, but organized according to the best in human being, which is human rationality, and the activity of a rational creature should be organized towards moral duty. And in the case of the Romans, moral duty almost always overlapped with political virtue and civic duty. And this noble-mindedness, this civic concern that is characteristic of those Romans who are viewed as the greatest figures in Roman culture are associated usually with this refined and rather austere stoicism. In fact, the word stoicism comes from stoa, for porch, and the reason why it was connected with the Roman word, or the Greek Latin word for porch, is because the Stoic philosophers used to get together there, used to teach there, and that is why I would say that Stoicism is that fragment of Greek philosophy which has the most direct and immediate connection, or which creates the most immediate and direct connection between Greece and Rome. There are other cultural connections, of course, in literary form. If you look at Roman sculpture, almost all of them are, overtly derived from Greek models. If you go and see a series of Roman sculptures and then see the Greek models from which they're derived, the lack of imagination of the Romans is remarkable. And while they are technically very able, many of their best impulses, their most profound artistic and cultural and philosophical impulses, are derived from these remarkable people, the Greeks. Now, if we include 200 years of Greek power starting in about 600 BC, and we take Roman history to be tapering off by the, say, 300s AD, we get almost 1,000 years of classical Greco-Roman culture. It's very clear that Rome is waning and that its cultural underpinnings are starting to break away, certainly by 313, when Constantine issues the Edict of Milan and makes Christianity legal for the first time, abolishes the persecution of Christians. And then later in the 300s, about 50 or 80 years after the Edict of Milan, Theodosius makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And the consequence of that is an overlapping of two completely antithetical cultural orientations. Christianity is essentially democratic. Nietzsche is right in historical fact. It was, at least initially, a religion of slaves. The reason why the scriptures, or at least the New Testament, was not written down for almost 100 years after the death of Christ is because almost all the people who were aware of the Christian scriptures were in fact illiterate. The Christian scriptures, the Gospels, were originally an oral tradition. Christianity was originally a religion which appealed to the underclass, to the oppressed, to the miserable. There is a certain degree of truth in Nietzsche's historical analysis of the social origins of Christianity, at the very least, if not the philosophical origins. Now, not only is Christianity opposed to the aristocratic tendencies in Roman culture, it's also opposed to the business of Rome, because Rome was a warrior empire, and Christianity is a religion which is, in some respects, in conflict with that tradition of violent conquest. And I'm well aware of the departures from this. I'll get to the Crusades eventually. But if you stop and think about an idea like perpetual peace, or like the universal harmony of mankind, these enter our culture not from the Greco-Roman tradition, these enter our culture from the tradition of Christianity. When St. Augustine says in The City of God that perpetual peace and the abolition of warfare is one of the things that God demands of all Christian believers, he is adding something to Western culture which the Romans could not possibly have thought up. The Romans were in the war business for 800 years. It is not likely that they are going to decide that the lion should lay down with the lamb. It's actually the lamb's idea. Now, Christianity is the most important cultural institution that survives the breakup of Rome during the Germanic invasions. And it then it is the sort of avenue which brings the Greco-Roman tradition into the culture of Western Europe, which develops in the early Middle Ages, And it is the one cultural institution which allows us to have a continuity between the tradition of rationality that comes out of Greece and the mythological tradition that comes out of Jerusalem. In other words, Christianity is probably the most important cultural institution in the West between roughly 400 and 1400. There's 1,000 years in which Christianity offers to the West a dogmatic theological orientation which is found in every part of culture. All of the architecture of this period is either not important or religious. All of the art of this period is either folk art, which is not especially impressive, or it has some religious orientation. Even the epics, which can be viewed in many respects as being part of a secular Greco-Roman tradition, have a profound Christian orientation. Those of you who are familiar with the Song of Roland know that Roland is a knight and he's a powerful kind of Homeric hero figure, but also he has God on his side, and Charlemagne, who Roland works for, is God's chosen, God's anointed. So we have here the confluence of Athens and Jerusalem in the art, in at least the epic tradition that we find in the Middle Ages. Think about the play Everyman. Everyman is a Christian morality play which doesn't show us any particular quality in any particular person. Rather, individuality is submerged to an expression of the human condition as it applies to everyone. In that respect, and in some other respects, Christianity is also the source of democracy, or is a very democratizing tendency in the West. If all souls are equal in the sight of God, that means that every individual human being has some moral value, independent of whether they have arete in the Greek sense or not. The Romans and would-be Homeric heroes, would-be Roman heroes like perhaps Friedrich Nietzsche, think this is a real downturn in our cultural orientation. And in fact, Nietzsche is correct in saying that there is a connection between the growth of Christianity and the growth of democracy in the West, and the growth of socialism in the West. The concern that all people be given a fair shake is something that we do not get from the Greek logos. We get it from the mythos that comes from Jerusalem. Now, another important consideration when we look at the Middle Ages, at what I would call the age of Christianity, between roughly speaking 400 and 1400, is the fact that individuality is submerged and not very important in this case. If you read something like the autobiographies of the great Christian saints in this period, you will find that imitatio Christi is their central focal point. In other words, they are not trying to develop their own subjectivity because they think their own subjectivity is sinful and disgusting. They are trying to develop their character to the point where they can imitate Christ, and that is their only serious concern. Everything else goes by the wayside. They are perhaps Kierkegaardian before Kierkegaard. Now, look at the way this is shown in the kind of art that comes in the West between roughly 4 and 1400 AD. Let's look at the sculpture of the West. What are the sculptures of the West like? Are they like the Greco-Roman sculptures that we see in the earlier classical tradition? No. The sculptures are for the most part religious, and you're going to find most of them in abbeys or in churches or in cathedrals. And they are not sculptures of individual people, they are sculptures of the saints, and they do not represent anybody's physiognomy. They do not represent any individual. They represent an idealization of what St. Joseph, for example, should have looked like. It doesn't make any difference whether it's a faithful representation of St. Joseph's face or St. Anthony's suffering, so long as it has the qualities we want to attribute to St. Joseph and St. Anthony. If you want to see the only analog of secular sculpture in the Middle Ages, you'd have to look at the suit of armor. A suit of armor is a sort of representation of the human form. It has its practical significance, naturally enough, but in addition, it is almost entirely lacking in individuality. It will have to be, of course, fitted to the particular person who is to own it, but if a knight in a suit of armor does not have his shield and does not have his coat of arms, you can't tell who he is. And the point is, it doesn't make any difference because individuality, subjectivity, is not a big question in the Middle Ages. Rather, we talk about the collectivity, we talk about the whole Christendom is the big issue, rather than Christians as specific entities. God will take care of the individuals. The church takes care of the culture as a whole. So let's consider the other arts and their connection to Christianity. Architecture. The typical architectural construct of the Middle Ages is the cathedral, not the individual villa or house. The typical painting or the typical woodcut from the Middle Ages is even more revealing. If you look at, say, the altarpieces from the Middle Ages, there are a lot of these in Germany and in the Low Countries, they have representations, visual representations of God and angels and peasants and kings and bishops and the Pope and all kinds of things. And one thing that is very noteworthy that immediately stands out to us moderns is the fact that when you see a picture with peasants in it and archbishops in it, the peasants are about this big and the archbishop is about this big. Now, this may strike you as odd, this may strike you as a lack of technical ability, but that's not what is going on here. These pictures are not being presented from the perspective of some human being. They're not supposed to be realistic representations of the world if what you mean by realism is how it looks to you. The peasants and the archbishops, in their disproportionate sizes, are being represented as God sees them. The visual art of the Middle Ages takes the God's eye perspective, and God thinks that archbishops are bigger than peasants, or at least he looks that way to him. They're more important than the average man in the field. That's why the archbishop will be this big and the peasant that big. It's not a lack of technical capacity. Go look at any of the great cathedrals of the Middle Ages. There can be no doubt about the technical capacity of these people. Rather, what they are trying to do is gesture at the fact that we want the synoptic God's eye view of all things, because that's the only art which is divine, rather than sinful, rather than self-indulgent. Now, let's take it a little bit further than the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages begins to break up the feudal system, the static organization of society, which was connected to it, begins to be undermined in various ways. Heresy had always been a problem, and of course, Thomas Aquinas, being the canonical interpreter of the Christian and Greek philosophical tradition for the Catholic Church, said directly that we must burn heretics, not because we have any malice towards them, but in fact they could spread this to other people. And of course, the body is not nearly so significant as the soul, so we're doing everyone a favor by rooting out heresy, even especially by the most violent of means. So perhaps we will understand then all the atrocities that go on during this period, all the religious intolerance and all the unnecessary evil harks back to the limitations of such an intellectual orientation. And the Crusades are in some respects the apogee of this. If you can imagine a religion that in the time of Augustine was the counterpart, was the antipode of the Roman emphasis on war and power and might, there's a saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You could almost say that you're talking about a new religion by the time you've moved from Augustine to the age of the Crusades. And the conflict between Christianity and Islam did no good for either side, but the end of these wars does bring into southern Europe Islamic learning, which is extremely sophisticated and extremely advanced, and which adds immeasurably to the culture of the West. Thomas Aquinas synthesized this learning, brought in Jewish learning as well, and created an intellectual construct which connected Athens and Jerusalem. So Aquinas gets Aristotle, brings him in, gives him a baptism. He's reading Jewish authors, he's reading Islamic authors, he's reading as many authors as he can, and brings it all together into one synopsis that is put together just at the end of this Christian era, and which is the sort of intellectual or philosophical high point of this tradition. Thereafter, it's all downhill, or at least some of it's downhill. The Black Death disorganizes Western European culture. Islamic learning, particularly brought into the Italian city-states, along with remnants and connections to classical culture, give the southern part of Europe a head start in the Renaissance. They're starting, say, with the time of Petrarch, roughly 1350 or so. And the Renaissance goes on until, it finishes out in the northern European countries, I would say roughly 1600. And the Renaissance, this revival of paganism, creates an unprecedented development of art in the West, and also an unprecedented development of the classical, reasonable, human orientation towards culture. Let us look at visual art. The great artists of the Renaissance were the ones who developed the mathematical theory of perspective and who started painting things not from the God's eye view, but from the human view. This signalizes a dramatic shift in cultural orientation from the divine to the human. The invention of perspective is a way of saying that it is not a waste of time, that it is not somehow profane to represent the world as it appears to mere frail mortals. In fact, it is possible to add to the greater glory of God by showing the world as it appears to ordinary human beings. And this new realism is a signal that the age of humanism is upon us. If you think of the development of literature that comes along at this time, things like Petrarch, or if you think of the development of political theory at this time, I think you will find that this humanism is quite striking in its changes. Machiavelli is the kind of leader of this humanistic charge, and for all his evil, for all his malice, we cannot deny his brilliance, and we cannot deny that what he wants to do is move the orientation of political theory from up above, from the idea of God's eternal justice and God's eternal law, to the profane lack of justice that we find here in the world. It's a revival of Thucydidean skepticism and Thucydidean cynicism, and it's a revival of the power politics characteristic of the Sophists. When you read the Sophists, when you read the Platonic dialogues, and when you finally go to Machiavelli, think of him as the greatest of the Renaissance Sophists, and you will understand a great deal of his argument. Go back and compare the arguments that he makes about politics and about power to the arguments made in the first book of the Republic by Thrasymachus. I think you will be amazed at the similarity. Some things never change. Now, not only do we see a change in the orientation of the visual arts, a change in the orientation of political theory and political science, we also see the change in sculpture. Look at Michelangelo's David and ask yourself if that could have been constructed during the Middle Ages. Not a chance. The realism, the simple humanity of these sculpture, the moving qualities of these do not by themselves lead our thoughts aloft to God and to metaphysics and to biblical revealed religion. They make us think that there may be some value to this world, that maybe human beings have a nobility which is not entirely appreciated in the art characteristic of the Middle Ages. It is a most humane and human time, and it's not restricted, these Renaissance advances, to Southern Europe. In Northern Europe, we'll find people like Copernicus, we'll find people like Kepler, we'll find people like Albrecht Dürer. We'll find a great many people who are creating a new humane and human approach to culture, which is essentially a revival of classical paganism that is not treated as being antithetical to Christianity. Remember that I'm not drawing either or distinctions here. What I'm doing is talking about the emphasis of culture. And there is clearly a renewed emphasis on the secular, on the human, on this worldly things in the Renaissance, which makes it a profound change from the previous 1,000 years of Western culture and history. Now, in the Renaissance, paganism is explicitly drawn in to Christianity, and there are many abuses that are attached to this. One of the problems that comes with the change in orientation from the next world to this world is an emphasis on worldly goods, on worldly possessions, on the satisfaction of bodily desires, which is alien to the culture of the Middle Ages, and which is, in many respects, an easy avenue to abuse. If you think of the idea of selling indulgences, of giving people essentially get out of hell free cards, that allows them to sin as they would, provided they have the appropriate amount of money, you can't think of anything less consistent with the spirit of biblical religion. The Reformation is a response, a Northern European response, to these to the revival and rebirth of classical learning and of human orientations in culture that we find in the southern parts of Europe during the Renaissance. Luther says in the opening of the Renaissance, or in the opening of the Reformation, that we must cleanse Christianity of all these pagan elements. And he is quite right in noting that there are a great number of non-scriptural, essentially pagan traditions at large in the West at the time. After 1,500 years of Christianity being the main focal point of culture, or at least 1,500 years that Christianity had to absorb the tradition of Greco-Roman culture, it should come as no surprise that there were many incorporations which have nothing to do with Jerusalem or its orientation towards the world. So Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and all the great reformers want to go back to Scripture, want a cleansed Christianity, which is no longer oriented towards this world, which rejects the temptations of the flesh, the temptations of the body, which rejects and forsakes this world for the next. Now, the difficulties that emerge from this are quite clear. In the first case, the conflict within Christianity moves from the religious realm to the political realm almost immediately. And however desirable the reformation of Western religion is, the political consequences of it are an age of religious wars which are unparalleled in their ferocity and which have disastrous cultural consequences. The population of Germany decreased by roughly 1/3 during the age of religious wars. Catholics killed Protestants, Protestants killed Catholics, non-combatants were killed for being non-combatants, Jews were killed by all sides, Islamic peoples, if they could be found, would of course be killed, heretics of every stripe were killed. It was a great attempt to create a refinement in our culture, but the downside of it was a period of political turmoil which undermined the prestige of religion among the intellectuals of the West. In some respects, the next phase of Western culture, with its concentration on nature and science, will be a way of saying that the intellectual life of the West has become disgusted with the political consequences of the orientation towards religion, and instead of taking God as the centerpiece of high cultural discourse, next nature will become the center of high cultural discourse. I would be inclined to say that the age of modern science, which I will, for want of a better term, call the Enlightenment, the period that goes roughly from, say, 1600 to 1800, is the age in which humane European intellectuals decided that the disputes over religion, characteristic of the Reformation, were fruitless, that they did no compliment or did no good thing for the culture, that they did no service to Western Europe, and that in fact humane men of goodwill ought to find some new topic to research and investigate, and this perhaps would allow for a non-controversial settlement of disputes between people of humanity and goodwill. The most important development in the Enlightenment, which is a sort of secular, humanistic, Athenian reaction to the Reformation, is the rise of modern natural science. And the rise of modern natural science is what makes the West the West. Natural science is the greatest intellectual breakthrough of the last 500 years, and the rise of modern natural science is what ultimately leads to the development of technology, the Industrial Revolution, and the domination by the West of the entire rest of the globe. It's not that Europeans had never encountered people in other parts of the world prior to 1492. The difference is that in the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s, Europeans have a new theory of nature. It's called physics. And this physics gives them an unprecedented control over nature, because applied science is called technology. And we are going to move from the age of muscles to the age of machines. And it turns out that by getting this unprecedented control over nature, Western European countries also got an unprecedented control over society. It was an epoch-making change in the history of the world. Bacon, Galileo, and ultimately Isaac Newton put together a theory of nature which was of unprecedented power, and this new theory of nature had tremendous repercussions for the rest of the culture. Social science gets born. If you think about Montesquieu, if you think about Locke, if you think about Spinoza, if you think about somebody like Berkeley, if you think about Hume, if you think about Kant, if you think about all the philosophers during the age of the Enlightenment, all of them are one way or another reacting to the advent of modern natural science. There is no way that any phase of culture can ignore this. In addition to that, the literary and artistic life of the West is also changed by the rise of modern natural science during the Enlightenment. Let's take a work of literary art that comes in this period. Let's take Robinson Crusoe. It's the perfect instantiation of the Western orientation towards the world and their connection to the rest of the world. Robinson Crusoe gets shipwrecked on an island. Let's call that island the state of nature. Let's call him the individual cogito. I think, therefore I am. Go back to Descartes. He's the lone ego. And what does he do? He does all this rational stuff. As a matter of fact, throughout the book, the word, and it's written in English, the word rationality is constantly capitalized. Go back and have a look. And there's a reason why. Not that Robinson Crusoe is irreligious, but he is the perfect instantiation of Western rational man. And what does he think about the rest of the world? They're savages and cannibals and need to be killed. Not all of them, of course. You occasionally find the nice savage, like Friday, and you can tell a good savage from a bad savage by A, whether they're cannibals, and B, whether they're inclined to become your butler or not. In other words, the Western conception of the rest of the world is encapsulated in this literary form. Do not miss the wisdom in literature. It tells you a lot about the world. Now let's get beyond this. Let's look at what happens when modern science develops. Well, if we start with Bacon and Galileo, and then we formalize this conception of nature with Isaac Newton, well, it's only a matter of time before further extrapolations will be made. We'll get things like Boyle's law of gases. And the same culture that produces Boyle's law of gases, remarkably enough, is going to end up producing Watt's steam engine. And it turns out that the same culture that produced Watt's steam engine is going to be the first culture to have the Industrial Revolution. And as Adam Smith says, the age of machines means things like the division of labor, an increase in productivity, a tremendous increase in wealth. And what this means is that it's possible for us to ransack the rest of the world and essentially throw fuel on the fire of industrialization, to stoke the furnace of Western science, and this creates an unparalleled and unprecedented change in society. The age of science leads to the age of machines, and the age of machines leads to modernity. Now, the age of machines is not without its downside. It's dehumanizing, and it causes an enormous amount of hardship, both in Western Europe and in the rest of the world. In Western Europe, the age of machines causes crushing oppression and misery for whole generations of people. I mean, we cannot avert our eyes from this fact. Going back in its earliest case, when we see the division of labor at the time of Thomas More, when he talks about the sheep that eat men, driving people off the land into the cities, this movement from the land to the cities, from the countryside into urban areas, means that there's going to be a workforce there, and it's going to be possible to hire people at very low wages. And once the Industrial Revolution becomes a self-sustaining process, people will be sucked from the countryside into the cities, and they will be used up and thrown away. A great deal of misery and hardship is the cost of this sort of technological process. It is not true just of Western Europe. Look at the industrializing nations today. There is inevitably a certain degree of hardship and exploitation and oppression associated with this. It's not the only element, contrary to Marx, but it is one that can't be denied if one wishes to be intellectually honest. And there is a group of people that want us to be intellectually honest and want us to confront the evils of the machine age. And these people are called the Romantics. Romanticism begins, let's say roughly the time of the French Revolution. Let's say Romanticism begins with a terror. Because terror, anguish, pain, worry, profound emotional states are the favorite things for Romantics to experience and talk about. All of Romantic art refers to heightened emotional states. They love deep sentiments and they distrust deep thinking. Let's think about, let's try music. Think of the music of Hector Berlioz. Compare that to the Brandenburg Concertos and ask yourself which came from the age of science and which came from the age of Romanticism. The age of science is instantiated in Bach's Brandenburg Concertos. You feel like you are walking through a giant clockwork. You feel like the Newtonian universe has assumed sonic form. That's what the Brandenburgs are all about. Think of Telemann, think of Vivaldi. All that same stuff is running through the culture at the same time. If you want to hear the difference between the age of the Enlightenment and classical formality and the age of Romanticism and profound emotional states, put Beethoven's First Symphony on and then put on Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Beethoven's First Symphony sounds like Haydn. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony sounds like God. And the distinction is quite clear. Listen to it and you hear it. And if you can't hear it, well, then try some other mode of art. Consider the kind of changes that we're going to get here. Romantic novels, for example. In romantic novels, reason never gets a capital R. Romantic novels are about starving children. They're about misery. Please, sir, I want some more. Think of Charles Dickens's novels, probably the greatest romantic novelist in English. Here's a general axiom. All novels about children are romantic. They reflect a nostalgia for lost innocence. They reflect an assumption that sentiment is more important than reason. Those of you who are familiar with Dickens' novel Hard Times, what's the first line in it? Facts, facts, facts. Mr. Gradgrind is the send-up, is the caricature of the Enlightenment intellectual who's only concerned with facts and rationality. Look at all the clever children there that don't know anything. Ask yourself why and what he's trying to tell you about sentiment as opposed to reason. Dickens is not the only example. Think of William Blake and the dark, satanic Mills. Adam Smith doesn't think Mills are satanic. He thinks they're the best thing since sliced bread. On the other hand, he probably doesn't think about Satan very much either, does he? Blake thinks about Satan. Blake thinks spirits come and give him his poetry. All of romantic art is rebellion against the age of the machine. It's a revival of heroic individuality at the expense of objectivity, at the expense of science, and at the expense of reason. You find it in music, you find it in literary art, you find it in painting. Think of David, think of any of the romantic painters, think of Turner, those seascapes. Turner's seascapes give you an idea of how romantics see the world. It's a big, foggy mess. It's very moving, but who knows what's going on out there? And to be honest, who cares? I'm only concerned with what goes on in here. I have a good soul, I have nice feelings, the world out there is kind of hazy and murky, and we kind of like it that way. We'll turn it into a virtue. All of romantic art does this. Take note of the fact that the first half of the 19th century produces rather little in the way of scientific achievements. Try and think of the great scientific achievements of that. Aren't very many. Maybe we could say Bentham's utilitarianism, but very little in the way of science. It produces great art because it produces great sentiment. It turns out that this is one of the necessary elements in human culture because it's one of the intrinsic elements of the psyche. But Romanticism is a movement of protest. And in the long run, you can only protest for so long. There is a kind of counterattack against sentiment, against gooey emotion, what T.S. Eliot called undisciplined squads of emotion. There's a counterattack against that in the last half of the 19th century. Let us call that the age of science, or return of science, or son of science, or science part 2, whatever you want to call it. It's more of the Enlightenment. The friends of logic and reason and objectivity and knowledge say, away with this self-indulgence, let's have some reasoning. Let's have a focus on nature. Let's get back to brass tacks. Let's say the opening salvo of the age of science, the revival of science, 1859, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. What else goes on in the last half of the 19th century? Maxwell's equations, connecting gravity, or connecting electricity and magnetism. Pasteur's biological researches. And let's say the capstone of it, And in addition to that, we'll also get Frege's contributions to logic and the increase in logical capacity, or the capacity for logical analysis. The capstone of the age of science is Einstein's special theory of relativity, 1905. And we would say that perhaps the age of science ends with the advent of the First World War and the mechanization of destruction. The literary art of the age of science also reflects this cultural orientation. Elementary, my dear Watson. Only a scientific age could create a hero like Sherlock Holmes, a man who spends all his time deducing things from careful observation of the world, a man who knows the 28 kinds of cigar ash. Romantic heroes don't know about things like that. They have really good feelings. Think of literary realism, Balzac, Zola, Flaubert. All of these realistic tendencies are a revolt against the gushy sentimentalism of romantic literature. Think of how Thomas Hardy would have felt about Dickens' novels. He'd throw them across the room. In Dickens' novels, you always have a happy ending and everyone feels good at the end. Thomas Hardy's novels, everyone dies. Think of Jude the Obscure. The whole family dies. He knocks them all off, and he has them kill each other in a kind of grotesque comment upon the ironies of the human condition. All literary realism is essentially positivistic and scientistic. Now, let's conclude by looking at our own age. Our own age no longer believes in objectivity. It distrusts science. It distrusts certainty. We live in an age of anxiety. We live in an age of subjectivity. We live in what I will call the age of the ego. And all of our culture is oriented towards this. Think of our literary culture. Think of something like Joyce, Portrait of the Artist, Ulysses, a reformulation mythically of one day in one life. Think of, even more, something like Beckett, Sartre, Camus, D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence would have gotten along very well with most of the darker romantics. Perhaps his taste is a little too sexual for someone like Dickens, but what's more subjective than the writings of D.H. Lawrence? Doesn't he force us towards an emphasis on emotion, on feeling, on strong passions that are in some respect in conflict with the ideals of objectivity and reason and certainty? Doesn't our cultural orientation suggest that we live in an age of revived romanticism? Like the Romantic Age, our politics are the politics of heroism. Think of FDR, Hitler, and Stalin in the middle of this age. Our politics are irrational and essentially violent. We do not believe that it's possible to reason questions out, so we are stuck with the prospect of fighting them out. And in fact, there has been a sort of loss of faith in the Western intellectual tradition, at least insofar as it is connected with the idea of dispassionate rationality and objectivity. Existentialism is a part of this. Logical positivism is an attempt to hold off the flood of subjectivity, but even there they concede so much ground that the only thing that we end up able to talk reasonably about is not very important. As Wittgenstein says, one feels that even after all philosophical problems had been solved, the real questions of human life had never been touched. As we stand now, it could be that we're looking towards a change in our culture, a change in our orientation towards the mythos and the logos. There's no guarantee either way. What we can say is that if we do not get more rational, we do so at our peril. And I think there is room for optimism, but no certainty. We are not given any final solutions to the problems that our society has created and our world has created. But we know that every place in the world has adopted Western conceptions of physics. No matter where you go, when people want to do engineering, they do it based upon the knowledge of nature that was developed in the West in the last 500 years. This possibly suggests that what we can see is a general globalization of culture. And if it is possible to globalize culture, not simply from a Eurocentric or Western vantage point, but if it is possible to globalize culture with an appropriate appreciation of both the mythos and the logos, not just the mythos and logos characteristic of the West, but the mythos and logos as they are bearers of authentic human meaning and authentic human wisdom, then our culture will have contributed something that is of incalculable value to the human species, and that gives us ground for thinking that hope may be a virtue.